Howdy folks, the Kentucky Derby is coming up this weekend, and while I don't care at all about horse racing, I do care about ice. And so I thought this would be a good opportunity just to talk about crushed ice, a couple of different methods for making crushed ice. We could make some juleps and see what kind of ice performs best in your mint julep. Let's check it out. So I got three pretty good methods of making ice for juleps. They all have their advantages and disadvantages, so I think what we'll do is I'll run you through the three options. A little later we'll make some juleps and we'll see how the ice does. Now, option one is this sort of tiny ice tray I have. I found this at the thrift store, but these are called Houdini ice trays if you're looking to find one of these online. Now this is obviously not crushed ice, this is more like pebble ice, little tiny ice cubes, but I've been finding them pretty useful for like tiki drinks and other kinds of drinks that need a lot of ice. So I thought it might work well in the julep, but we'll see. So here are the pros. You can make it ahead, just a little couple days preparation, and you can have a ton of these little tiny ice cubes. It is very consistent. All the cubes are the same size, so you have a known rate of melt, stuff like that. And it's sort of no fuss. You can just sort of pull these out of the freezer and start using them. On the other hand, crushed ice is, usually a finer ice, like a smaller bits of ice, which will melt faster. And in things like a julep, that might be what you want. We're trying to get the outside of the cup to get frosty, so it's possible that these little cubes won't do that as effectively. Also, it is a little time consuming. It's a little hard to get the ice out of the cubes, so you do have to spend a little time and preparation ahead of time to make the tiny ice cubes. And this method has no wow factor, no banging of mallets or anything like that. Which leads me to option number two, which is the Lewis bag and mallet method. This is a very old school way of making your crushed ice. Basically, you get one of these Lewis bags. It's like a waxed canvas bag. You stick your ice in there, and then you have at it with a mallet. Now, the pros to this one is that you get to buy a giant mallet. This thing is a pro all by itself. I love owning this thing. It's huge. It's like, I don't know, it feels great. Also, it's super fun and dramatic to smash this ice in the bag and make a huge ruckus. And of course, the third pro is that it's making crushed ice. This is literally what we want, is ice that's been crushed. We're crushing it with this hammer. It's gonna make all those fine little particles. Now, on the con side, it is inconsistent. You don't really know how smashed up your ice is going to be. There might be big chunks and tiny chunks. The ice is a little hard to get out of the bag. Like, it takes a lot of work to scrape the ice that tends to stick to the inside of the bag out of the bag. It's a little bit of a pain. And at the end, you have this wet bag that you have to dry out. Option number three is a fun option that I like a lot. I found these little devices that are, I think, from the 60s at the thrift store, and they're designed for crushing ice. Now, I've got two of these. I call them Wesley and Beverly. And the pros of these is that it's fun. It's fun just to have these objects around. It's something I like. So another pro is that these are adjustable. Most of them will have a setting for fine or coarse. On this one that I'm using, if you turn the crank in one direction, it's coarsely chopped. And if you turn in the other direction, it's finely chopped. I kind of prefer the finely chopped direction. It's easier to turn, it's easier to do, and I want smaller chunks for this. And at the end, you get a fairly consistent size of ice. So that's a pro. Now, on the con side is the ice does get kind of wet. This is sort of similar to the last method as well. If you want to do this ahead of time, you could crush up some ice. But if you put sort of wettish ice in the freezer, it's going to freeze back together into a mass, and that's sort of the opposite of what you want. Also, these little ice crushers can be a little awkward to use, but it's easier to get the ice out of this than it is to get out of the bag. So those are the ice options. Now, let's talk about juleps real quick. Now, juleps are a very old drink. They're very simple, just 4 ingredients: mint, simple syrup, bourbon, and ice. And of course, like lots of old drinks, these were originally not made with bourbon. They were originally made with cognac. There's no reason you have to use bourbon and mint. You could swap out the bourbon for some other base spirit. You could add an additive if you wanted to. You could use a different herb besides the mint. But we're going to today use the classic mint bourbon julep. Now, the way you make these is you muddle a little bit of mint in the bottom of your metal cup. with some simple syrup. I'm going to be using this metal cup kind of thing that I got as a promotional item some years ago. You don't have to use a metal cup. That's sort of the traditional way, and it's kind of fun, but you could just use a glass if you don't have a metal cup. Just put your sugar and mint in, give it a little muddle, not too hard. Then you can add your bourbon. For mine, I'm using JTS Brown. It's my go-to inexpensive bonded bourbon. Should be delicious. And then add your ice. Stir it around till you get a nice frosty outside of the cup, sort of like a swizzle. Then you add more ice on top and put in your mint for garnish. Okay, we are almost ready to make our juleps, but first we need to get some mint. The mint patch outside is sort of pepped up a little bit in the spring. It's getting a little perky. So I went out and I cut a little bit of mint. Now what you want to do after you cut your mint is you want to pluck off the leaves off the bottom of the stems and save that for muddling. The other end with the nice pretty tops and the long empty stems you'll use to garnish later. If you leave a nice long stem, you can shove that down into your ice and it'll hold the mint in place. Oh, and after you've prepared your mint, just stick it in a glass of water to keep it from wilting. All right, so time to make some juleps. I've only got 2 of these little cups, so I'm gonna make these drinks one at a time. I'll talk about each one after I make it, and then we'll meet you back here for some conclusions. With the tiny ice cubes. I was afraid it wasn't going to get frosty on the outside, but it has frosted up here eventually. These ice cubes do tend to fall off the top. They're not sort of staying in a nice dome. That's one disadvantage. But that is a lovely julep. A little hot maybe. It's possible these ice little cubes haven't melted quite as much as maybe the crushed ice will. I'm getting a lot of bourbon, and I was expecting it to be a little bit more dilute than that. But let's move on to julep number 2. This is julep number 2. Again, the cup nice and frosty. This is the Lewis bag ice. It's a little inconsistent, like I was saying before. So there's some big chunks here that didn't melt, and then the little tiny shards melted right up. So it's nice and frosty, but some of these big chunks do like to fall out. Let's give it a taste though. Okay, that melted a bit more. So that had a quicker melt. Those little tiny shards of ice that you get from smashing with the mallet melt straight away into the bourbon. So this isn't quite as hot. A little bit more refreshing that way. It's more like a drink and less like having a shot of bourbon, if you know what I mean. Julep number 3 looks about the same, nice and frosty. This is the ice from the ice crusher. It is a nice size. I like the fine setting on that crusher. It makes it a nice small size of ice, and that's working out fine. Yeah, delicious. Very similar in the dilution level from the smashed ice, I guess we'll call it, the Lewis bag ice. Delicious julep. I didn't quite make enough. I needed a little bit more ice to sort of dome up the top, but we're getting the idea. It's not really falling out, and it's frosting up the mug nicely. So, conclusions. I think the little ice tray isn't working great for this. It didn't quite dilute the drink enough, and you couldn't really mound it up on top because the ice cubes would fall off, because they're cubes and not crushed. So I'm gonna say that's not the best method. The Lewis bag method worked pretty well. It had some bigger chunks, but the thing about the Lewis bag is if you want smaller chunks, you can just keep hitting it. Hit it harder, hit it for longer, and you'll get smaller chunks. One thing you do have to look out for is you need to start with plenty of ice, like really a lot of ice, because you're gonna lose some along the way. It'll stick to the bag or whatever, but that method works and it's super fun and you get to have a giant mallet. The ice crusher method I also really like. You stick with the fine setting, you can get some nice small pieces of ice. I would suggest crushing your ice right before you make the drink, because if you leave it in the freezer overnight, it tends to freeze back together. So I'd say, yeah, if you've got a Lewis bag, stick with that. If you have nothing, go to the thrift store and see if you can find one of these ice crushers. They're super cool. Next time you make a julep, try doing it with something other than bourbon, just for fun. That's what I'm gonna do next time. In the meantime, thanks for watching and we'll see you next time.